You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 404, recorded on Sunday, December 19th, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Idaho is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill. This week's episode is focusing on some of the political and news media effects of another plastic that changed the world, nitrocellulose. While last week's topic of polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, both allowed for the rise of phonograph records and greatly changed the construction industry, nitrocellulose changed not only mass entertainment, but also the way people received their news. Newsreels brought the news to life for audiences. Newsreels became very important during both World War I and World War II, although, as we'll discuss, they didn't tell the whole story of what was happening on the front lines. As television subsequently became more widespread and available to more people at home, movie theater newsreels struggled to stay relevant in an increasingly fast-paced media landscape. But first, let's discuss the nitrocellulose that made newsreels possible and the innovations that led to capturing motion on film. Today's episode is going to focus primarily on the newsreel as a medium specifically, but of course we can't separate it from the overall movie industry, both at a corporate level and in terms of the physical innovations of the actual industrial processes and products underlying those companies. We'll begin at the beginning, naturally, with the discovery of the relevant plastic in the mid-19th century as the first industrial revolution turned to the second, where we so often begin these episodes. As always, our episode notes and sources will be posted in a PDF at arsenalfordemocracy.com with this episode. So, getting started with the invention of nitrocellulose and then its industrial production in the U.S. In 1855, the first man-made plastic, nitrocellulose, which was branded Parksine, patented in 1862, was created by English inventor Alexander Parks from cellulose treated with nitric acid and a solvent. In 1868, American inventor John Wesley Hyatt developed a plastic material he named celluloid, improving on Parks's invention by plasticizing the nitrocellulose with camphor so it could be processed into finished form and used as a photographic film. This was used commercially as celluloid, a highly flammable plastic that until the mid-20th century formed the basis for lacquers and photographic film. Before its use in motion pictures, celluloid was used for still photography. From the Wikipedia article on celluloid, English photographer John Corbett founded the Keystone Dry Plate Works in 1879 with the intention of producing gelatin dry plates. The celluloid manufacturing company was contracted for this work, which was done by thinly slicing layers out of celluloid blocks and then removing the slice marks with heated pressure plates. After this, the celluloid strips were coated with a photosensitive gelatin emulsion. It is not certain exactly how long it took for Corbett to standardize his process, but it occurred no later than 1888. A 15-inch wide, or 380 millimeter, sheet of Corbett's film was used by William Dixon for the early Edison motion picture experiments on a cylinder drum kinetograph. However, the celluloid film base produced by this means was still considered too stiff for the needs of motion picture photography. On May 2, 1887, Hannibal Goodwin filed a patent for, quote, a photographic pellicle, or a surface onto which photographs are produced, and process of producing same, especially in connection with roller cameras, end quote. But the patent was not granted until September 13, 1898. In the meantime, George Eastman had already started production of roll film using his own process. Nitrocellulose was used as the first flexible film base, beginning with Eastman Kodak products in August 1889. Camphor is used as a plasticizer for nitrocellulose film, often called nitrate film. Goodwin's patent was sold to Ansco, which successfully sued Eastman Kodak for infringement of the patent and was awarded $5 million in 1914 to Goodwin Film. The flammability of nitrate film was the cause of many disastrous fires in cinemas, as well as film studios and film processing plants. Storage vaults containing early film reels, as well as negatives, were destroyed in the early 1900s, also destroying the history of film up to that point. Even if nitrate film wasn't the cause of a fire, it quickly exacerbated flames and escalated the damage. So while it was a very useful product for capturing motion on film, the chemical properties of nitrocellulose were also very dangerous. During the year 1914, the same year that Goodwin Film was awarded the $5 million patent infringement settlement from Kodak, nitrate film fires incinerated a significant portion of the United States' early cinematic history, In that year alone, 5 very destructive fires occurred at 4 major studios and a film processing plant. Millions of feet of film burned on March 19th at the Eclair Moving Picture Company in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Later that same month, many more reels and film cans of negatives and prints also burned at Edison Studios in New York City in the Bronx. Then again, on May 13th, a fire at Universal Pictures Colonial Hall, quote, film factory in Manhattan consumed another extensive collection. Yet again, on June 13th in Philadelphia, a fire and a series of explosions ignited inside the 186 square meter or 2,000 square foot film vault of the Lubin Manufacturing Company and quickly wiped out virtually all of that studio's pre-1914 catalog. Then a second fire hit the Edison Company at another location on December 9th at its film processing complex in West Orange, New Jersey. That fire, a catastrophic one, started inside a film inspection building and caused over $7 million in property damages, which is the equivalent of $181 million today. The danger of nitrate film fires led many cinemas to fireproof their walls with asbestos. Projectionists were trained on how to handle the film reels and had to get certification to do so. A training film included footage of a controlled burn of a nitrate film reel. After ignition, the film is submerged in water, where it continues to burn. The chemical makeup of nitrate film includes enough oxygen to sustain the combustion reaction, so starving the fire of oxygen isn't a possible method to fight the fire. Nitrate film is so dangerous that it was banned on the London Underground, as seen on Inglourious Basterds. In addition, when a cache of nitrate film was uncovered in Yukon, Canada, in the 1970s, the film was moved by military transport for its safe return to Canadian and U.S. archives for transfer to safety film and storage. The circumstances of this accidental archive were unusual. The reels had been buried under an abandoned hockey rink in 1929 and inadvertently uncovered in 1978 during construction excavation. The reels had been preserved by the permafrost, which delayed the deterioration of nitrate film. Another quirk of the nitrate film molecular makeup: as nitrate film disintegrates, it releases nitric acid, which is a highly flammable powder, which actually catalyzes and accelerates the disintegration process and further increases the flammability. Starting in the 1940s and 1950s, cellulose acetate film, or quote-unquote safety film, replaced nitrate film because it was much less flammable. However, its chemical instability has become a major threat to film preservation and archiving. So that's kind of the overarching industrial picture of nitrocellulose and nitrate film in particular. So to talk about the media that this film could innovate, the newsreel, Bill is going to discuss the history of the newsreel.
Yeah, and obviously, as you noted at the beginning, you can't really separate these two things, newsreels and movies, but this is not, a history of film episode other than literally describing the film itself. So we're not really going to be talking too much about the movies, but it's important to understand that these, of course, went hand in hand together, the newsreels and the movies, being produced by the same companies often, the same distribution, airing, at the same sessions in these cinemas, that kind of thing. By 1908, the French company Pathé Frères, which had started in the 1890s as a phonograph company, had expanded into the emerging movie production and distribution business, and they had already built hundreds of cinemas in France and French-speaking areas of Belgium. At that point, they came up with the concept of newsreels, adding a fresh draw to their cinemas by producing current news content around the world. By 1910, they had opened offices all over the world, both to support their new newsreel production and to strengthen their market position in production, distribution, and innovation of film products. Now, some speculation from us, not from the Pathé article on Wikipedia, because they don't really get into this kind of thing. I would guess that one reason that newsreels were well positioned to sort of take the world by storm after 1910 is that they, we'll get to how widespread the market was in a moment, but you also just had a lot of sort of interesting military crises that everyone wanted to see on the screen that happened shortly after this, and that was a ready-made sort of series of events. So newsreels kind of took the world by storm, and they would cover things like among many other things, the events of the 1911 Franco-German Agadir crisis, I believe, then the chain reaction of Ottoman wars of 1911 to 1913 in Libya and the Balkans, which eventually spiraled, as we know, into World War I in 1914. And, of course, it probably goes without saying for all of our listeners that newsreels quickly became a fixture of wartime government propaganda, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But the company Pathé, which created these newsreels back in 1908 and really started popularizing them over the course of 1909 and 1910, they're actually still one of the major film industry players in the world market. I'm sure that any sort of cinemaphiles listening would already know that. Others might not be aware of that. Various divisions were sold off in the years between the world wars before and during Depression-era financial troubles for the company, but underlying it, the company still pretty much survives, at least the core part of it. And I just thought that was interesting that they were such an early pioneer and they're still around. And of course, this goes to this point, right? This is a movie production company. It was, at the time that they started doing newsreels, also a cinema distribution business. And they come up with this idea that is inseparable from these other components, which is to show newsreels to the audiences when they're there to see a movie. Now, the early newsreels run weekly in 1909 by Pathé and then spreading to other companies and distributors were visual or text-based only. Or they might have had live musical accompaniment, just like the films themselves, but they did not include audio in the reporting itself. Pathé did produce English language newsreel content for British and American audiences pretty quickly, starting in 1910 and 1911. Pathé was effectively uncontested in American markets for serious newsreel efforts, at least as far as I'm aware, until William Randolph Hearst launched a competitor in 1914. And I believe three other competitors, or I should say significant competitors, as opposed to failed startup examples, three other significant competitors launched in the 1920s and one more in the 1930s, which brought the field to, if I have my math correct, 6 major players in the U.S. British and American entrepreneurs opened cinemas that solely showed newsreels on a loop all day, rather than showing them ahead of some other movie. But of course, the image that we have of the newsreels alongside the movies is basically correct for a lot of cases. It's just important to note that's not the exclusive way that these were shown or distributed. I think it's also worth noting that there were some animated newsreels competing against the traditional newsreels in the very early years. I wasn't completely clear on what those were and didn't have an example to look at, but I think the idea of those was sort of kind of bringing newspapers to a visual medium as opposed to sending out a film crew to film news events. Not that animation wasn't expensive, but obviously you can do it in one sort of central location as opposed to sending out correspondents with a whole team of people to, deal with these huge bulky cameras, and then you had to safely transport all this flammable film back and so forth. So I think there were some companies that tried to pursue this sort of animated news format instead. So let's go back to the topic of World War I, because as I said, I don't need to tell our listeners that wartime propaganda, newsreels, is an important part of that. But interestingly, a lot of that image comes from World War II, not so much World War I, although newsreels did exist. So why is that? Well, newsreels were initially quite restricted in their coverage, and again, this was a new medium, because it was considered, and I think reasonably so, an intelligence risk to be publicly showing the situation behind each side's lines. It also probably would have created some home front morale problems to show the visceral horror of the battlefields, even at the point of contact between the lines. And that is something we're going to circle back to toward the end of the episode, because there were eventually some newsreels that apparently did kind of get into how horrifying the situation was. And this was not a message that went over well with government authorities that were, trying to propagandize the population. The process of creating the newsreels themselves was also, I think, understandably, given that this is a new medium and we're not in the era of, embedded journalists or war correspondents of the kind that we would, later come to see deeper into the 20th century, this was just considered to be an unacceptable safety risk to the filmmakers themselves. And the same treatment, I should emphasize, was given to still photographers, especially at the beginning of World War I as well. So things generally had to be, for the purposes of having a motion picture rendering of some event in the war that was being relayed back to the home audiences, that had to be staged at a more remote location as a reenactment, basically at a safe distance. And this practice was also concurrently being done by Americans to cover the wars of the Mexican revolutions that were happening at the same time. And you can listen to Mike Duncan's Mexican Revolution series on his Revolutions podcast if you want to hear more about sort of the American filming of Pancho Villa and that kind of thing. Eventually, some of the production restrictions that existed at the beginning of the war in 1914 were loosened or relaxed a bit as the governments kind of figured out how to produce explicitly propagandistic newsreel footage of the war. And newsreels overall during the war, of course, remained heavily censored in terms of message and content. In 1915, German-American audiences made a smash hit box office success for the newsreel titled The German Side of the War, which was one of the few media sources actively showing the German point of view to the U.S. market during the neutrality period. Although, I should emphasize they were also careful in this newsreel to show the Russians too, and to emphasize that every belligerent army in the war was not going to be defeated quickly, and for lack of a better term, seemed in it to win it. The Chicago Tribune provided the news footage from Europe to produce this newsreel, and they were given access by multiple countries on both sides of the war. In 1917, however, newsreels, including those under the oversight of President Wilson's infamous Committee on Public Information, became pivotal in producing a very rapid shift in American public opinion specifically, which had been against joining the war, and the public had just reelected Woodrow Wilson on the 1916 slogan of "He kept us out of war." So in order to get people on board with the war very suddenly after years of promoting neutrality, newsreels were an important way of propagandizing the population. In 1918, the American government, in concert with the French and British, worked to deploy newsreels worldwide, promoting Wilson's 14 points vision of the post-war situation, even if the French and British governments didn't actually agree with that vision, because they knew that this vision being presented in the newsreels would at least sway many countries to support the Allied powers over the Central Powers as the war wound down. Ultimately, within the United States, the official government propaganda news efforts ended up being so ham-fisted and riddled with absurd fabrications or political attacks that kind of bothered members of Congress, something that we talked about similarly with our episode on the American Protective League. Eventually, the upshot was that the U.S. government shifted in subsequent decades, such as famously World War II, toward a much less direct propaganda strategy. Instead, they relied on close cooperation with or financing of malleable private newsreel production studios and newspaper publishers rather than trying to do everything in-house. It was just sort of a more elegant solution to work more closely with the capitalist entities to do that, rather than trying to do all of it directly or just feeding misinformation to the reporters who then would get upset about that. They figured out a better, more nuanced way of doing the propaganda later on. I don't know, Rachel, did you have any thoughts about the sort of situation in World War I before we continue on with the early newsreels?
I think it's fascinating that it was mostly like staged reenactments. I think compared to today, where we do have like the people on the news on the front lines embedded with these companies and whatnot, it's kind of interesting and almost kind of funny that it was being reenacted and staged. It kind of brings to mind like various cheesy TV shows like Dateline or like any of the true crimes like reenactments. Just seems a little cheesy or a little unserious.
Right. And in their defense, like, this would have been part of an overall propaganda strategy of sort of recreating the situation. I remember that there was famously a construction of a replica trench network that I think was done in London, so that members of the British public could, see what the boys were getting up to over in Belgium or wherever they were. And they had elaborately built this whole thing, the sandbags and the digging the, down into the ground, and you could kind of see what it would look like. At least that's what they were telling the public. They were obviously not really replicating the full horror of it, not only in the no man's land, but also just how bad the trenches were themselves. The trench works were very elaborate, so it's hard to kind of describe it in a specific way without having overgeneralized, but certainly I don't think they were showing off like the flooded trenches and everyone getting trench foot and things like that. And so this is sort of like another way of doing that. But also, again, it gets to that aspect of the technical limitations of the medium, right? If you have giant, bulky cameras, that's already going to be a problem on the battlefield compared to later filmmaking and television camera technologies that would be adopted subsequently. But you also have all kinds of issues with lighting, right? So that was something that came up a lot in the Pancho Villa stuff with the Wars of the Revolution in Mexico. The mythology ends up being that, they were carefully sort of stage managing this image for Pancho Villa. And obviously they were presenting a specific angle that they thought would appeal to American audiences. And in that respect, it wasn't totally truthful. But a lot of it just simply had to be restaged because you couldn't be filming during the light levels that were happening when they were doing an attack, right? A dawn raid or a dusk raid isn't going to show up very well on film. So you wait until they win the battle and then kind of recreate it after the coast is clear. That's a much safer and more effective way of doing it, and probably logistically a lot easier. But, again, no getting around the fact that it is manipulating reality and it's propagandistic. But this is the version of things that people would be seeing. Now, even outside of the wartime context, newsreels tended to present a very specific perspective. In our imagination, we might all think about dramatic, tragic footage of the Hindenburg explosion, although, as a side tangent here, in fact, the famous and pioneering radio recording that everyone is familiar with, the Oh, the Humanity one, that was not used at the time in conjunction with newsreels of that event. It was used for radio purposes rather than for newsreels. The newsreel coverage of that event actually used after the fact narration by others, right? They weren't using that radio recording. Subsequently, people kind of spliced them together for modern audiences. But in reality, again, when we're not talking about wartime things here, newsreels actually tended to shy away from heavy topics most of the time. That's according to the Princeton University Library. They were certainly avoiding presenting both sides of a debate in the way that the narrative tends to be framed, or at least our expectation is that it tends to be framed in modern TV news coverage. Newsreels were, according to the analysis on the Princeton link that I looked at, they were an entertainment product first and foremost. So weighty news coverage or covering unpopular political and social fault lines were not really conducive to that goal for the proprietors of the movie theaters. So a lot of newsreel content was arguably fairly frivolous. This was especially true in the later years. Obviously, sometimes later on, the focus shifted a bit more towards serious news, whether it was disasters, wars, race riots, things like that. But in general, it actually tended to be a lot more like, here was a diplomatic event that happened, here's everyone shaking hands, something like that. Or here's the Lindbergh flight, which we'll talk about. Here's a local contest that happened, or this guy was, ate a lot of pies, right? Something really kind of silly like that. So according to Robert J. Gordon's 2016 statistical compilation book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, which we've cited many times this year on the show, the audience potential for newsreels, and this is going back to the beginning, was significant by the time it was invented. In 1908, there were already 8,000 nickel movie theaters just in the United States. These were known as Nickelodeons, and they served 4 million customers per day. By 1911, Nickelodeons started being supplanted by much fancier movie theaters with more amenities. Within a few years, the era of major motion pictures had begun. By 1922, which is after World War I, 40 million Americans per week were going to the movies, overwhelmingly in urban areas. For less than 10 cents, or sometimes a couple quarters, a moviegoer would spend a few hours at the theater, or movie palace, as it was sometimes called, watching a news review, educational material, comedy material, various other things, and, of course, a feature silent film, accompanied by live piano or organ music. The first talking newsreel was in May 1927, covering the Lindbergh transatlantic flight, a few months before the first talking movie was released. Just before the Great Depression, weekly movie theater attendance reached nearly 3/4 of the population, although, of course, that might count some frequent viewers multiple times in reality. And at the worst part of the Depression, weekly attendance was still nearly half of Americans, and by the late 1930s, it had rebounded and crossed back over the 60% mark of the population each week, where it stayed until the TV era. And that brings us to the heyday of newsreels. So the peak of newsreels, and especially the kind that we tend to think about, would have been in that talking era, and it would have been in the run-up to, the Great Depression and the run-up to World War II, right? That's the type of stuff you tend to see depicted in movies about going to the movies, or they have a scene that goes to the movies. So according to a page that I pulled from the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, motion picture newsreels were an important means of mass communication from the 1920s through the late 1940s. By the 1930s, some 85 million Americans attended one of 17,000 movie theaters each week. At most film screenings, these moviegoers saw newsreels, short subjects updated twice a week from 5 companies: Fox Movietone, News of the Day, Paramount, RKO, Pathé, and Universal. The newsreel helped the film industry cement political connections with Washington, and it gave many Americans their first look at the performance, so to speak, of presidential speeches and addresses, projecting personality in a way that would become increasingly familiar through radio and television in the coming years. Now, Robert J. Gordon also reports in his book that during World War II, a full 23% of Americans' recreational spending, though not, of course, their overall spending, went to the movie industry. And by the end of the war, something approaching 90 million Americans were going to movie theaters each week, with a newsreel generally being shown between double feature showings. And this brings us to an important point that we haven't touched on yet, which is the role of segregation in this. Now, can't really speak to the situation in other countries because we were focusing this episode on the United States, but you can't talk about something like this, a commercial leisure activity, without getting into the issue of segregation. So you would either have explicitly segregated facilities or default segregated facilities, but the upshot of all of that is that you have a lot of theaters that are serving only white audiences and a lot of theaters that are serving only black audiences, and so on. Accounting for widespread segregation and trying to appeal to a wider market, while also incorporating black audiences into the wartime propaganda efforts of World War II, All American News was established to begin releasing special newsreels for African American moviegoers in 1942 at 150 black cinemas nationwide. And I think that's, again, to emphasize, we're talking about 150 black cinemas versus, say, 17,000. And not surprising that this would have been undertaken with government support, probably, because for financial reasons that would have been necessary, given the sort of relative scale we're talking about. The Library of Congress holds a collection of these targeted newsreels meant for black audiences. And quoting from the Library of Congress, there are currently 35 All-American newsreels in the National Screening Room, released between 1942 and 1945. Those are just the ones that are in that specific context. There were a lot more, obviously. Topics include sports, music, significant events, success stories, human interest stories, black contributions to the war effort, and of course, black troops fighting in the Second World War, end quote. The newsreels on the war and covering black service members sometimes expanded to full documentary films. But after the war, the company pivoted to also produce fictional feature films for the same audiences, featuring all black casts with storylines about things like black cowboys and so on. Because unsurprisingly, in this era, you would kind of have, well, this is the movie that white audiences are going to see. Now we'll make a black version of that, right? That was a pretty common thing to have happen under capitalism when there was segregation happening. And this brings us to the decline and end of newsreels. So newsreels coming out once or twice a week had always had to compete with the immediacy of newspaper and radio by emphasizing its vivid visual element, but it would, of course, struggle against daily television on that front. Early television news broadcasts in the U.S., which began in 1948, initially drew heavily on the newsreel model and even called themselves newsreels at first. For example, where theaters had sometimes had a narrator in person to accompany silent newsreels or included a voiceover narrator in the talkie newsreels, the earliest TV news programs would use a narrator to contextualize and explain the footage on screen, and this eventually became the news anchor. Newsreels came to an end in the United States in 1967 after struggling along for about 20 years in the age of television, and 10 years after that, in 1977, the New York Times published a sort of obituary for newsreels to mark the release of a retrospective from Greenwich Village-based nonprofit cinema film forum in February 1977. The opening of the article I found to be sort of an interesting wrap-up on the age of the newsreels and a summary of its strengths and weaknesses as a journalistic medium. Quote, "The newsreels died on American screens in 1967, but they were in poor shape for 10 years or so before that. There was no way they could compete with television news footage, either in speed or convenience, nor generally speaking in quality. Most of the time they were patchy views of a rather scatterbrained reality. Sneezing contests would alternate with politicians cutting ribbons and South Americans rioting. But once in a while there was something unforgettable. The Hindenburg floated loftily into sight and suddenly settled on the ground like burning tinsel. A middle-aged Frenchman wept at Toulon when the fleet was scuttled. The newsreel cameras and big screen provided an authority to these things that television equipment couldn't manage. Also, there was the effect of waiting a day or two to see a disaster you had read of. World events were discrete, individual, weighty. They did not flood us." Now, I don't know if I agree with all of that in that quote, because, of course, the thing here is that any of these type of one-way visual medium things with a very limited amount of airtime, although obviously more in the case of television than a short newsreel, they're really, picking and choosing, right? So this idea of like, oh, they're not flooding you with information. It's like, well, yeah, they're giving you a highly restricted version of reality based on the physical constraints, the capital cost constraints of production, and the limited amount of airtime available to, show this off. Not necessarily something to be mourned in that specific way, because I think it misunderstands the overall situation, but whatever. Newsreels survived longer in other markets, even into the 1990s, actually. Presumably, I'm thinking mostly that would be in places that had a lot less TV access in the 1970s and 1980s. But Pathé, the original company making newsreels, did make newsreels all the way from 1908 until 1970 when they finally stopped. And I do want to take one sort of lengthy tangent here to talk about Canada because of its relationship to the situation in the U.S. and because I think it illustrates some of the specific points that we've been talking about throughout this, and then we can kind of have a wrap-up discussion. So interestingly, a lot of countries, including some major ones, didn't ever really develop their own domestic newsreel markets. They were competing with global hegemons like the US, the UK, and France. And Canada, for example, largely just imported American newsreels, despite numerous advocacy campaigns to try to get domestic newsreel industries going, including from one prime minister. Unlike with the CanCon or Canadian content laws that would come into effect for television later to grapple with the dominance of American TV content, and I would argue were probably inspired in part by some of the not very successful lobbying with regard to newsreel and film content in the 1920s. The kind of domestic content minimums mandated by Canadian content laws did not ever really play out for newsreels. And this was apparently especially infuriating during World War I, when American newsreels promoted neutrality as Canadian troops were dying in large numbers on the Western Front, and then abruptly, as we talked about earlier in 1917, pivoted to nonstop coverage of the American intervention, again with essentially no coverage of the Canadian contributions to the war for the preceding several years before the U.S. joined the war, or even after the U.S. joined the war. And we talked earlier about the idea of kind of limiting access to the visual horror of the war. And apparently, the one kind of big exception to that was that a lot of the British newsreels, as the war progressed, got more and more grim. And they didn't really emphasize Canada either, even though, they were supposed to be all in this together as the British Empire and so forth. So it didn't really help to bring in British newsreels to address this problem from the American newsreels in terms of the war coverage. But also, the government censors decided that the British newsreels had started reaching a point that they were so grim that it was dangerous for recruitment and morale to show them in Canada. So they didn't really do that, and it was just better to stick with the U.S. ones that didn't do anything for the Canadians. And the problem with U.S. newsreels and their sort of skewed perspective was repeated again in Canada during World War II, almost unchanged, basically demonstrating that the problem had just simply not been addressed. And there were also ongoing concerns about audiences in French-speaking communities in Canada during this period as well. And I didn't really want to get into that super heavily because that's a much more complicated topic, but that obviously would have been, an issue in terms of nationalist unity during the war and between the wars and so forth. But one reason I wanted to talk about this is because I think it demonstrates kind of the immense capital requirements to do newsreels, which is not something that you necessarily think about or hear about. So the finances and the capital constraints of the problem, without having some sort of huge government financing project, are particularly apparent in 1920s Canada, especially in contrast to the many advantages that the United States had going for it. And so I want to quote here at length, and I'll link to this, but basically there was this very long article and study, an academic work, I believe, on the sort of newsreel situation in Canada. And so I'll quote from that. One of the problems with getting newsreel coverage of Canadian events was that there were not enough cameramen. Despite claims by major international newsreel companies that their cameramen were stationed all over the world, the beats assigned to cameramen were impossibly large, and there were never enough freelancers to fill the gaps. In 1920, Fox boasted that it had 106 cameramen in the United States, and Canada, 82 of them in the United States. That left Canada with only 24, just about the total number of cameramen in the entire country. Even so, the cameramen were not just shooting newsreel stories. To earn a living, Canadian cameramen also worked on educational films, travelogues, sponsored films, and other nonfiction films. Feature film production in Canada itself was just too sporadic to be a significant source of employment. In 1926, Colonel John Cooper, the president of the Canadian Motion Picture Distributors Association, asked the head of the Ontario Motion Picture Bureau to help supply Canadian news. Cooper said that the newsreel companies found it too expensive to include Canadian stories in their reels, particularly those stories taking place far from Toronto. This would have also created problems again with the issue with Quebec, but that's not mentioned here. Cooper suggested that the Ontario Motion Picture Bureau cameramen film the news stories as a pool service for the newsreel companies. There was some interest in supplying some feature items, drawing upon the Bureau's information films about subjects such as agriculture, mining, and tourism, but he said that they did not have the resources to cover spot news, and so nothing came of the idea. And that's sort of the theme throughout this article, is that people would float some idea of how to fix this problem, and they just never really did it, because, of course, what it would have taken is significant amounts of throwing money away and not making a profit. So again, I went on a kind of a detour about the Canadian thing just because I think it illustrates some of the key aspects of this from an industrial perspective and a capitalist perspective. So, Rachel, I'll stop my narrative there and let you catch up on some of these points if there were anything that you wanted to comment on about sort of the peak period of newsreels or the decline and fall of newsreels.
Well, I just wanted to point out that we've talked on quite a few episodes about like the urbanization of the U.S. population happening in the 1910s and really accelerating in the 1920s and 30s. And so it really created the conditions for the success of these cinemas, like a big population base that is willing to spend their entertainment dollars at the cinema and to come together and watch these newsreels. So it's kind of interesting to see how all these aspects that we've talked about just kind of come together and affect things as simple as newsreels and entertainment in such a profound way.
Yeah, and the Robert J. Gordon book actually says that in 1919 in Toledo, Ohio, if you pretended that one ticket was being sold per person per week, right, not somebody buying multiple tickets to go a bunch of times during the week, it would be 130% of the population of Toledo going to see a newsreel every week, which tells you that, in fact, there were a lot of people going a lot of times per week. But the point being that this was a huge feature of this interwar life in the United States as it was urbanizing.
Right. And I'm actually, another point I wanted to bring up was like how late newsreels kind of endured. They were definitely limping along, very struggling a lot near the end, but it's actually really surprising that they survived so long after the age of television started. It's kind of shocking because you don't really think of that, and I don't think you really see it in like period media at the time. You don't really see like a 1970s audience or a 1960s audience watching a newsreel before a movie. It doesn't seem as present in popular culture as it was in, like, say, the 1930s or 1940s.
And in fact, a lot of these companies just stopped making them in the 1950s. They pieced out long before the last ones were aired. So it really would have been quite a long and serious decline. Did you have any thoughts about the sort of the points from that article on the Canadian newsreels and kind of the hegemony, the cultural and media hegemony of the United States?
Yeah, I hear about the CanCon laws quite a bit. I listen to some Canadian podcasts, so it's kind of interesting that they just hadn't really established those standards yet at that time, and just how much of a struggle it was to even get started to build the industry. I think in the U.S. we're very good at innovating a technology and just kind of taking over. And investing a lot of capital into it. So while we could pour a lot of money into the film industry, that just didn't exist for our neighbors up north, and it's kind of hard to think of it that way because we're kind of in the water and we can't feel it. So we see like the U.S. establishing their stranglehold on a new technology or a new type of media, and you don't really see other countries kind of struggling to establish their own versions of those industries.
Yeah, and interestingly, although some of the Canadian content stuff started in the 70s or so forth for musical radio, like what we now know as the kind of Canadian content system and requirements, that only comes in at the beginning of the 1990s. So, a lot of this stuff really like the dominance that the American capital provided culturally and in the media, was massive and really lingered around a long time before anything was done about it.
Yeah, it brings to mind. I read the Anna Green Gables books a lot, and it definitely covered World War I and World War II in a way that we definitely didn't experience. Though it was.
Yeah, it was hugely defining culturally within Canada, and I can imagine their frustration at getting all these American newsreels that were like, "Stay out of the war, don't participate in the war," and then all of a sudden, the Americans are in the war and they're here to save everyone. That must have been very aggravating.
Right, and it just was such a longer slog because of our reluctance to join in the wars. So it's a very different perspective that I think is pretty valuable to look at and compare and contrast.
Any other concluding thoughts on nitrocellulose and newsreels?
I was fascinated to learn that it was the first man-made plastic. That is a very interesting factoid there.
Yeah, but it's also fascinating that they seem to be able to make it actionable much more quickly than PVC, which we talked about on last week's episode.
Yeah, there definitely wasn't that like 90-year gap between the discovery of it or the invention of it and finding a practical application for it. So that was pretty interesting too, just as a point of comparison to PVC.
All right. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on this week to talk about nitrocellulose plastic film and the results of newsreels on the political and entertainment sphere.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure.